Vital Transformation recently published our research on the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act on the Medicare age population. You can download that report for free at our website, vitaltransformation.com. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation, and today I'm joined by two of my colleagues in our Grumpy Old Men podcast. And in the interest of gender equity, I'm also joined by our first grumpy old lady, MSD's Virginia Acha. Hello, Virginia. Welcome to the club.
Hello, Duane. I'm so excited to get to be the first grumpy old lady. Well, I know I won't be the last.
Well, I'd like to say, we know many grumpy old ladies, but you are the top of our list, Jenny.
Excellent. I'm super grumpy.
Exactly, which is why you're here. Thanks for being here, Jenny. I'm also joined, as always, with Dr. Joe Hammang, VT's U.S. Business Director and a card-carrying neuroscientist. Joe, how are you doing today, sir?
Great, Duane. Thank you. Great to see you, Ginny. It's been a long time, and always good to see you.
And, of course, we're also joined by Dr. Harry Bowen, VT's consulting economist and a professional purveyor of common sense. Hello, Harry. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for the kudos.
You're sounding particularly sedate and non-grumpy, Harry. Do we need to get you some coffee or perhaps some agitation?
It's coming. I'm just holding off.
I would expect nothing but Harry. Okay, here we are all together. In the summer of 2022, the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act, a.k.a. the IRA. I have to admit, I'm in London, and saying the words IRA here for some of us who are older does strike a little bit of a different feeling. What exactly was the IRA supposed to accomplish related to drug pricing? Harry, I'll start with you.
Well, it was to reduce the prices of drugs. That was the intention, and to lower the cost, of course, to Medicare in terms of the reimbursement that it would have to do. So lowering the costs that government would undertake in providing the drugs, but was going to help all of us old people afford our drugs. And sadly, as is pretty typical with price controls, that's probably not what really happens. But that's a topic for maybe today and later in another podcast.
So, Ginny, obviously at Merck Sharp and Dumb, you have a drug that is probably going to be negotiated in Keytruda. What was your concern initially when IRA was announced? What were you thinking about when you heard this proposal?
Well, I think the main thing, and I just want to go back to Harry's grumpy point, which I would add to, which is actually, if you go back on the Medicare site, even today, it says that you'll have increased access to innovative and life-saving treatments. And I think the focus on cost has followed ever since. But the access is also something that is increasingly a focus for us all, should be. And that's not just for today's cohort of medications, but also to future ones. So I think our first thoughts, especially I sit in the research labs, was this changes a lot of the calculus on the way we look at R&D. It adds a whole other layer to the chessboard.
If access is seen as separate from cost, is this a valid statement, Joe? I mean, can we separate access and cost, Joe? I mean, you're an old hand at this.
Well, building on what Harry and Ginny just said, it's very clear that there are a lot of unintended consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act. As our research showed, what it actually is going to do is it's going to reduce innovation. It's going to reduce the availability of medicines. And dangerous part of it is that it actually hurts the Medicare population more than anything else. And it's so unfortunate because here we are trying to develop new products that will allow people to live longer and more healthy lives. And it's giving us just the opposite. It will not provide that. It will be the opposite. And that's really unfortunate.
If you look at the study we published, which is called the Inflation Reduction Act's Impact Upon Early Stage Venture Capital Investments, and you compare that to, say, what the CBO had put out, Director General Swagel in December of 2023 was quite adamant that they saw no impacts from IRA and what was coming down. When you actually folded this back and built the data set that specifically looked at early stage investing, so not the mature trees that, a company like Ginny's is chopping down to make lumber, but, the stuff at the front end where we're planting the seedlings, the people who are taking the real risk capital, what you're really seeing is that what was sold as a benefit to the Medicare age population for reduced cost. What it actually has done is investors are going, I've already got a 92% failure rate. Now I'm not going to take a 50% hit on revenue. And we can actually show, particularly with those small molecules, that there are people pulling away. Harry, why would an investor suddenly say, I'm done, I'm not going into this space, particularly with Medicare exposure? Why would they do that?
In terms of the life cycle of what happens in drug development, and Ginny can talk more to that, of course, Joe and you too, but if I have a longer time to have exclusivity in the market, then that's going to make that particular investment more attractive. And what has happened was the pill penalty, as it's called, with small molecules already came up potential for price negotiation after 9 years, but large molecules were at 13 years. And so this created, as we showed in our paper, a disincentive in terms of how investors now, just starting out thinking about the future, are saying, why do I want to invest in a drug where I only have, let's say, 9 years of exclusivity when I can invest in another drug with 13 years of exclusivity? And that means more profits, right? And it also makes it more viable that the drug would be researched and potentially created, because you have a larger stream of potential profits that can cover those expenditures for research and development and other activities that are necessary to create that drug.
Ginny, why do you think there was such a misunderstanding about how this market works? I mean, you're obviously in the industry. Even as far as Rita Conti's testimony last April, where she said, we're still seeing no evidence of this. And what's fascinating is it was really, everyone was grabbing the publicly available data, which is mostly, Merck, Pfizer, Amgen, the big elephant companies, the big ones. Why did they just not understand where the impacts were going to be? Why did this not connect?
Well, and I think, you mentioned about smaller companies or investors. I think you're right. I think they misunderstood, as Harry's just described, they misunderstood how R&D in drug discovery and development works, but I think they also misunderstood how R&D investment works. And they've been looking at global figures, sort of number of drugs or overall R&D spend. I mean, I've made this point before also with Rena. You may not see my R&D figures go down, but we weren't going to leave the industry, but it does mean that we do things differently. So they didn't understand what I think Steve Usden put really nicely in a BioCentury article, where he said, the IRA essentially moved the rocks in the river. So don't be surprised that the river flows differently. Well, it doesn't mean that the river doesn't flow. It is going to flow differently. And if you don't understand those impacts, then you run into the conclusions that Joe already mapped out.
If you look at some of the biologics, I mean, still, and we can discuss if 20 years is the right number, but biologics generally have had 20 years in the market, ones that are targeting Medicare. Now they're going to drop by 13. I mean, that's still multiples of billions of dollars sucked out of the sector. I mean, this is still, we're still going to make the pie smaller. We got boulders in the river, but we're also putting a dam up and we're reducing the flow a little bit too. Harry, what's going to happen there? I mean, if we're reducing that flow?
Ginny had a good point, and I think that's the idea that, people respond to changes in relative gains, right? The gain of this is now looks better relative to another one. But I also think that, as part of that switching idea that we've talked about with, going more to large molecule rather than small molecule, I think that it will also reduce the overall level of R&D because there's just fewer investment opportunities. I think that drug companies certainly are looking for the magic one, the blockbuster, as we found in other research, and that, something like 20% of all the R&D that's done funds 20% 20% of all the revenue that's earned funds 80% of all the R&D.
Well,
right?
20%, 20 drugs, actually, 20 drugs.
20 drugs, yeah.
20 drugs fund over 50% of all R&D fluid.
And I've always liked your analogy to the movie industry with the blockbuster movie, and that's what funds all the independents and all the other ones. And if you don't have a chance to realize some of these blockbusters, which take enormous amounts of money, I think you will see fewer drugs. So to go back to Ginny's point about access, I mean, as an economist, I would immediately say access, price, same thing to me. But I think, it's just a consequence of, and again, restricting prices, making everything, hey, it's free. You can get it for free, but you can't find it anywhere. That's the problem. So that's the access part.
Joe.
Well, I want to go back to the fundamental problem with legislation like this. I think it goes back to this unbelievable lack of understanding of this marketplace, of the environment, and how drugs are developed. And I've wrestled with this for decades in my career. And I've always been very frustrated because, again, there's a feeling that developing drugs is like developing any commodity, that you just create the stuff and you sell it and you just move on. What is probably one of the most hard to describe, hard to teach issues with the industry is the failure rate. And that's what differentiates the biopharmaceutical industry from all others. The failure rate, especially in some areas, let's be honest, Alzheimer's and the others, is astronomical. 99%, essentially. We can argue with the decimals. It's just not the same thing as developing other products. If that isn't understood and it isn't appreciated, then you're really, really having a hard time to make this point and to get busy legislators, busy staffers to really understand what's going on. And that's why you end up with these unintended consequences. We're going to do this to reduce prices, and we're going to get just as many drugs out of it by, again, rearranging these boulders. And then we're going to look at it after all that rearranging is done, and we go, wait a minute. That didn't work out the way we thought it was going to work out. And that's what we're seeing here. The industry, I'm afraid to say, has done a very poor job over decades of explaining what drug development looks like, how difficult it is, how expensive it is, and how many products fail. And somehow, some way, that failure has to be paid for. And that is through revenues of successful products. It's just that simple.
Ginny, are you seeing changes in the way you folks are sourcing, targeting indications, buying companies, partnering with companies based on exposure to Medicare? Are you being more strategic? We've seen a ton of cardiovascular disease assets come in, not just the GLP-1s and the obesity, but there's even more stuff going there. We've seen the neurology acquisitions, depression, and schizophrenia. That's 18-year-old female, 24-year-old male. I mean, that's way down the line from Medicare population. Do you think this is an intentional approach to try and avoid IRA?
So I think you should obviously pay attention to what people say in their quarterly earnings calls, and I'm sure you all have heard the same as I have from some of the other companies where they've actually described some hard decisions that they've had to take. And I will say they're hard decisions. Joe knows this from personal experience. When you have researchers who've been working on an area for a long time, that's a baby. They don't like giving those up, and certainly not easily. But as I said earlier, it adds another layer on the chessboard. So you have to think about it. It's not the only thing that you'll think about. That's never true. There are many reasons why you follow particular paths, areas of unmet need where you have scientific opportunity, where something is, looking right. But just to make the point that, again, one of the boulders we talked about was small molecule versus large molecule. That's a big deal. But another thing to think about in indication development is also the therapeutic areas where disease progression is slow.
Yeah.
Or it takes a long time to establish. So one of the things that we've been particularly, keen to point out is this is if you've got a really artificially constrained period of time to do your development, your chances of getting into early stage treatments for cancer are going to become harder and harder to achieve, because I'm just not going to be able to have enough time built in to build out that clinical program in the right possible way. And things like dementia or Alzheimer's, where you have, again, slow progression, this is just anathema. Where you need time to do it, it's going to make it more difficult. And obviously, we don't want to see that happen, but your own study is obviously raised a lot of concerns. People intended these changes, and what do they do when they see those changes happening? The question I have, and I'm going to put back to you all, is how reversible is this? You know?
Let's face it, it's hard. One of my favorite examples, if you go back to the war on infectious diseases, back when the first antibiotics were developed, it was a miracle. People who had, just a regular old infection no longer died from it. It was life-changing. It was incredible. We really thought, science, thought that we had won the war against infectious diseases like bacteria. Well, what happened is there was a lack of investment, a drop-off in investment. Companies didn't go after new antibiotics because we didn't understand what was coming, which is antimicrobial resistance and all those sorts of problems. Well, when you stop investing in something and the intellectual capital goes on to do something else, they move into cardiovascular or they do something else, the chemical matter that's there and ready to be developed sits on the shelf, loses patent protection, etc. The bottom line is it takes decades to build that back up again. And that can happen in any area. When you see, one of the things that worries me most are the decisions around Alzheimer's disease right now and dementia in general. There's been failure after failure after failure, as we've alluded to earlier in this conversation. Those failures eventually turn off more and more investors, companies, people who are willing to put capital at risk. That's not a good thing. If there's a problem with reimbursement, that's another nail in the coffin, if you will. And that just leads to fewer and fewer opportunities going forward. So even though we're looking at trillions of dollars of medical healthcare costs over time, something like Alzheimer's, we're not cracking the problem. And I'm afraid that if we don't start making some significant advances in the field soon, there will still be efforts, but I'm afraid that many really good ideas are going to, go by the wayside. They're going to lie fallow.
You're a neuroscientist, Joe. The preferred pathway would be a small molecule. We've got two assets
Correct.
now that are approved that are large molecules. If you look at the sales and the statement, the last earnings call from Acha in the report in the 10K, they're saying that they've got higher growth now in Asia than they do in the U.S. in sales. Now, this is a combination both of the Inflation Reduction Act, the issue of pricing, but also Center for Medicaid Services, CMS's ruling on pricing and the coverage decision on the monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's. We literally now are seeing an effective treatment that had good data, very strong approval from FDA. It's got more sales in China and Asia than it does in the U.S. I mean, at a certain point, are we going to square the circle here? I mean, don't we want small molecules for dementia, Joe?
Yeah. Well, yes. And I'd add one other point to that, Duane, because it's also massive aging populations in those regions as well, which lends itself obviously to greater sales and a greater medical need, of course. The real problem with brain diseases, neurodegenerative diseases across the board, is something called the blood-brain barrier. We've talked about in past podcasts. The blood-brain barrier is critical, and it protects the brain. It's a layer of cells in your blood vessels in your brain that don't allow many molecules, especially large molecules, to cross and then get into the brain. So in other words, if you have something that won't cross this blood-brain barrier, you can give it until the cows come home. It just isn't going to get to where it needs. So that's where these large molecules have come in. But of course, they have to be infused into the brain. If you had your choice, nobody would want to have drugs infused into your brain. And along with that, you get side effects and inflammation. And this is what we're seeing over and over and over again. So the small molecules that we take, the pill forms, many of those drugs have the capacity to pass this blood-brain barrier and treat brain diseases. So that is the distinction. If there's a penalty on those pills, those drugs, the 9 versus 13 issue, which we've already discussed, it doesn't bode well, and especially in an area where the clinical trials are just painfully long. By the time you're done with the study, if there's only 9 years of protection, by the time you're done with the clinical trials, the patent life is significantly reduced, leaving you with a very small window to recoup your R&D investment.
Assi's clinical trials were 13.
Perfect example.
Yeah, that's a
Perfect
tough
example.
road. That's a tough road to hoe, Jenny.
Yeah, that's you done. You
Yeah.
haven't even got it launched yet.
Congratulations. Here's your biologic. Here's your biosimilar.
What if there were a prize offered for the creation of a drug that worked, and then they said, okay, if this actually works, then we will allow an extension of 10 years or something for you to recover. So you sort of make it contingent on proof of concept, so to speak, which is a clinical trial, right, and an approval by the FDA. But for some very, highly needed drugs, such as an Alzheimer's drug, why not provide some
an X prize.
a prize. Yeah. So not a moonshot. We don't want moonshots. We don't want moonshots. We want, tequila. We usually tequila shots, right?
Harry?
Yeah, that's it. But
that's in
but
an hour.
No, actually, and I know that they've had some legislation, okay, that is similar to what I just mentioned. But I'm wondering if maybe picking a couple of these areas where you could create that kind of a prize would be a good thing.
My initial reaction is it depends on the size of the prize. I mean, are we talking Pasteur, $800 million, which probably wouldn't have been enough? Are we talking, Mr. Monopoly getting $20 at the beauty contest if you pull up Community Chest?
It doesn't have to cost anything to the taxpayer. You just extend the exclusivity period. You just say, okay, you got it, and we'll give you 8 years, or we'll give you something.
It's not a million miles away from what happens now. I mean, when we have to prove additional indications, you get additional exclusivity to show value. All you're doing is kind of grouping it all together, which could be interesting. And I think that's the sort of things that you need to begin with, is you need to understand what are we solving for and what are the right incentives to get that particular scientific and productive outcome, especially bearing in mind that for the longer period of time, somebody's going to have to produce that drug. So it's not just in the moment that it's valuable, but that it's going to be sustainably valuable so that, 10, 20 years from now, it's still available. Which is something we never seem to hear, especially as, they've come up with prize ideas around antimicrobial resistance as an option. And you need to really think about, end-to-end solutions. It's the discovery, but it's also the distribution.
The CBO predicted roughly 1-2 lost drugs every 10 years. Obviously, we're already seeing an exodus of R&D, particularly early stage. Harry, why was it so wrong? Why was that number so off base?
When I teach economics and we try to understand the marginal principle versus averages. So I tell you that on average, the river is only 5 feet deep. It's a quarter of a mile wide. Would you cross the river when you know that at some point it's going to be 35 foot deep for 10 feet? Something like that, right? So you sort of ignore these, you look at the averages, and the averages miss a lot of the details or the marginal aspects. And that's where, what was really novel about the study that we've recently done was really to look at the early stage investors, and Ginny mentioned the word incentive, and I think that in terms of unintended consequences, that what people often don't think about is what incentives am I creating with this legislation? What am I actually doing? They only sort of look at something that's kind of a mandate, like, well, you're going to lower the price of your drug and we're going to save people money. But they just don't think beyond that one initial impact. They don't. Most people don't think to the second and third and fourth round. And as an economist, of course, what we look at is the incentives. What incentives are being created? And I don't think anybody that created this legislation thought at all about any of the incentives. And that's why we have many of the unintended consequences. But to go back to your question, so averages versus marginal. So the difficulty was that the research that was done by the CBO and is done by others is they just sort of look at the average effect, right? They don't really delineate or separate out these different actors in the way that drugs are created, and that goes to Joe's point, and others have said that too, that they didn't really want to understand, and certainly didn't understand how drugs are created and the failure that goes with it, but the whole ecosystem that's involved with the small drug companies. It's not the big drug companies that necessarily create these drugs. They do it in partnership with smaller drug companies, which can be acting independently, and then they're acquired or funded by large drug companies, and large drug companies, as part of the value chain, pick that up, and if it's successful, then they have the clout and experience and years of experience in marketing and dealing with all of the regulatory and other issues that have to do it, and it takes deep pockets to deal with that, is my guess.
Well, it's as we've discussed before, it's not economies of scale, it's economies of scope. I mean, Ginny,
right.
Your ability is, you can do a cardiovascular drug at the same time you're doing a neurology drug, at the same time you're doing a vaccine. I mean, you have this ability to move and duck and weave, or as the Brits would say, box clever, in multiple different modalities simultaneously and go very fast. That's really the power of large industry, I think.
Yeah, and that's the opportunity space that we can provide, but we're only one part of that ecosystem that Harry mentions. And if parts of the ecosystem are suffering badly, it affects all of us. So, we're all affected in different ways, but collectively it's a drag.
So the EPIC Act is a proposed piece of legislation that President Trump signed an executive order last week, basically quoting some of our data from our study, which is great and wonderful. And he basically said, look, you got 2 months to fix this. So the idea is the EPIC Act will move the 9 and 13, where the small molecule drugs in Medicare are getting negotiated at 9 years, price fixed, and the large molecules are getting 13. Ideally, everything would be 13. He didn't actually say that, by the way. He didn't. He just said he wants it fixed. That's another
Clever.
issue to get. Yeah, well...
or ignorant, one of the two.
Or tactical, for being cynical. There's a couple ways we can look at this. If we look at this from the CBO perspective, because obviously CBO is going to have to rescore anything that happens. My contention is, and Ginny, I'd like to pose this to you, the current analysis, one of the major flaws, and I know this is not popular with some of our clients, but this is the reality. If we're pushing a bunch of stuff from small molecules to large molecules, and you're putting all this strictly in Medicare Part B, and these are injectable hospital-induced drugs, most of them 75%. Those are just by definition, I'm sorry, they're going to be more expensive. That's just the way it is. They're going to be more expensive than a small molecule. The CBO didn't seem to make that accommodation in their analysis, that if we're going to see a bunch of stuff being pushed into large molecules, this is going to actually increase cost. Do you think that this needs to be considered if we're looking at rescoring this bill?
Well, I think the context overall needs to be considered. I wouldn't make a guess on finally what those different values are, because it depends on the treatment and how it's done, et cetera, et cetera. But that is kind of the complication of it. You need to understand how treatments form, how medication is used in a treatment pathway. What does that pathway look like? How is it overall reimbursed? I mean, we're sat here in the UK, but I know you know Europe very well, Duane.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, you can look at, again, again, at a drug that's been approved in Europe, and its use is totally different looking at whichever member state you're looking to. And part of that is the way the treatment pathway works. You need to understand that context. And looking in isolate to the price of a drug is really meaningless. It's not going to give you an understanding, particularly if you're concerned about overall healthcare costs, which is really the point. It wasn't about this, 10% of the overall cost. It was, how do we deal with healthcare? That was what American citizens were asking for, is some relief on that. Calling out some of the work that Kirsten Axelson's been doing with DLA Piper, that's exactly what they're trying to address is, does this even get close to that? So looking at it in the round is important. I don't think CBO did that. I think it's complicated to do that, to be honest, but it needed doing. I did find it interesting, though, that in the executive order, there was reference to other parts of the system, including potentially, I guess, PBMs.
And reference pricing.
Which I know you want to come on to. No doubt.
Yeah, well, that rears its ugly head, reference pricing.
Yeah,
all right, Harry, what's reference pricing? What are we talking about here?
Well, it's this odd system where you look out in the different markets in which something is being sold, in this case pharmaceuticals, and you say, well, gee, the price that those people are having to pay is different than the price we're having to pay. We're paying a higher price, they're paying a lower price. Well, why are we paying a higher price when they're paying a lower price? So we should reference our price to that lower price. Nobody references to the higher price. And therein, actually, here, of course, lies the problem for the pharmaceutical industry, because in most other countries, and I guess I'll reference the European Union in particular, but drug pricing is much more controlled, right? You have to negotiate prices, and whether you are allowed into the market or not depends on whether you agree with the bureaucrat that's setting those prices. Why are U.S. pharmaceutical companies willing to sell their drugs for cheaper prices in Europe? Well, partly because in the U.S. we don't have any price controls, okay? And so, and we have enormous barriers to trading drugs across boundaries, and therefore these markets are all isolated and protected in that sense. And so from the standpoint of the pharmaceutical companies, at least from an economist perspective, they view Europe and these other markets as isolated or segmented markets, the same thing that's very common in marketing. You segment markets by male, female, income class, and whatever, and then that allows them some ability to have pricing power, but not necessarily to raise prices. They're able to extend their markets at lower prices because they're receiving higher prices in other markets. It's called price discrimination. And so the problem with reference pricing is if we the United States, start to reference prices to lower price markets, the drug companies are just going to say, well, we can fix that. We just won't bother to sell this drug in that market anymore, and now there's no price, and so there's no reference price. The companies, of course, will make that decision about whether or not it's worth it to pull out of that market in terms of lost revenue or not. But ultimately, reference pricing, fails from the standpoint if I'm the pharmaceutical company, I have the ability to withdraw from a market. And I'm not going to withdraw from the U.S. market at the moment because the U.S. market doesn't have very many price controls. We have some now because we have the IRA. But this idea of referencing prices to what they pay in Indonesia is silly from the standpoint of the United States. Europe can get away with it because they're not the one creating any of the drugs, not as many of the drugs. And so, they're a peripheral market for the drug companies.
One piece I'd really like to add to that is for those who work in market access and are representing companies that are trying to get drugs into a market and to be reimbursed, would differ with the term negotiation, because there's not a lot of negotiation going on. It's kind of like here it is.
Right.
take it or leave it, and that's really the truth, and it's the problem with much of this. It really is.
Well, and Harry knows this is a monopsony structure.
Yeah. Yes,
right.
Yes.
So. Thomas Phillipson did a nice piece in the National Review a little while ago, and again, why he set out, he's been long complaining about the fact that there's been free riding on the U.S. For innovation in this regard. But, the idea that companies can solve it by just either putting up the prices elsewhere in that environment, which Joe rightly says that's not really negotiated, and you're dealing with a monopsony buyer. So don't have a whole lot of purchase on that. And secondly, that we can withdraw. I think withdrawing is a lot harder than you think, Harry, and especially in places where it's a necessary drug or it's an essential drug, that's difficult. And that's not something companies would do very easily.
Right.
But it also raises the current concern that Duane knows about, which is, in some areas in legislation, there's compulsory licensing in settings like that. So,
true.
We have a lot fewer levers to pull than people think, and it is a huge challenge. But I think it's one that obviously this executive order puts fair and square on the table again. And so I'm curious, like you all, what the possible solutions can be on this score.
Well, I'm sure reference pricing is just going to solve all problems of access and pricing, Jenny. Of course.
Hey, Duane, I just want to add one thing to what Ginny just said, and she's right on track. The decision to not sell in a geography also creates a reputational issue. And,
of course.
And, that's not appreciated. If you don't want to sell cars in a certain area, well, you got some other choices. A life-saving product that company X withholds from a market creates a lot of distrust and hate, and it's a horrible situation for companies to find themselves in, and they're loath to do that.
Part of the problem, though, there's a country in Europe that since 2012 has had a doubling in the size of its pharmaceutical market from revenues, and 102% of that growth has been funded by the industry itself, either through rebates or clawbacks.
Wow.
Literally. So, and that's adjusted for inflation. So y'all would have been better off in 2012, just basically said, we're good. We're going to just keep it right here, because literally 102% of that growth has been funded. So literally 2% plus you've paid 2% to grow 100%.
I think people are going to read that very carefully.
Well, yeah, probably not the politicians, unfortunately. Okay, one other thing that we're dealing with here, the Trump administration and its never-ending quest to make my life really interesting is threatening the implementation of tariffs on the biopharmaceutical sector in the never-ending quest to move manufacturing and solve all things wonderful and have the U.S. be 1955 all again. Harry, what happens if we move all of global manufacturing back to the United States for the biopharmaceutical sector? What's the first primary impact of this occurring?
Is that happening?
If it happens.
I haven't seen that.
If it happens.
Well, I mean, the tariffs would have to be pretty substantial, to tell you the truth. And I'm not sure what their rationale is in terms of these tariffs. I mean, there are some issues of so-called security of supply.
Sure.
And that's a
legitimate concern.
That's a legitimate concern. So we don't really know what shape this might take in terms of how they're doing it, but Trump's focus these days seems to be on trade balances and whether you have a surplus or deficit with the United States. So I'm not sure how they're going to attack the drugs in that context. Maybe you know more than I do at this point. The bottom line is I don't see a lot of reshoring of this activity, but the bottom line is they would just cost more.
Prices would go up.
Prices would have to go up because the cost of manufacturing goes up. So unless the drug companies can find whoever they need. The other thing, that, of course, is that in a country like the United States with relatively higher wage costs, the manufacturing processes attempt to be anyway, increasingly automated. So that doesn't really hire anybody. That just creates a job for a robot. And so it's unclear even what the employment impacts would be. It may be that in order to survive behind some kind of tariff wall, again, companies would seek to adopt techniques that are more machine intensive, more robotic, and so it's not even clear what the employment effect would be. When I teach international economics, I go through scenarios of looking at immigration versus tariffs or something like that. And if Trump really wanted to, increase all the manufacturing of anything in the United States, what he should really do is just import half of China's workers here and not have them subject to the minimum wage. And then we'd be great. And so, it's sort of counterproductive to but anyway, that's a different political issue.
A practical solution.
I think the tariff idea is very misplaced, personally, and there's a lot of arguments, and there are people that made arguments about so-called optimum tariff arguments, and of course those are there, but I think that it is a mistake to wall yourself off from the rest of the world in order to produce for yourself. The thing that we learned, the famous example, is Robinson Crusoe before Friday shows up, and Robinson is fishing and doing coconuts, and then Friday shows up, and Friday can climb coconut palms better, and so they specialize in what they do better, and there's more coconuts and more fish for everybody. And that's kind of the way that story goes. I do think, just as a footnote in that there were a lot of not well-recognized issues in the periods of globalization that we've had since the 1980s with regard to income redistribution that happened. I mean, the one thing that we try to emphasize when we teach basics theory is that while trade creates net gains, if you want to make sure that no individual within the economy is worse off, then there has to be some income transfers that take place, because there are losers and there are winners. But the winners win more than what the losers lose, and therefore, in principle, some redistribution is warranted in order to raise the losers back up to a level at which they're not harmed. We have a number of programs in the United States that do that, trade adjustment assistance and these kinds of programs. But I think that the impact in particular that we felt from globalization was so strong and powerful in terms of what it did in our manufacturing sector that there probably should have been some thought to more income transfers and training and other kinds of programs given to the people that were severely impacted by that.
This begs the question about the reversibility, just like the R&D reversibility. Is it reversible? And it doesn't seem easily reversible to me. It just doesn't for a lot of reasons. Number one, our environmental laws are just incredibly different than they are in Asia. Obviously, the labor cost has already been discussed. There are other very important factors here where the president may be able to approach something that looked more like 30 or 40 years ago, but I don't see that it's possible in any way, shape, or form. And I'm not alone in this thought, I know. You might bring some of it back, but it's really doubtful to me how much of it is going to come back for so many reasons.
So, Ginny, you're dealing with legislation in Europe now about water quality. Mm-hmm. So you're getting a huge amount of pressure from manufacturing in Europe. You're now getting pressure from the Trump administration around tariffs. You're also obviously being squeezed on a lot of the intellectual property pools that you have in Ireland. How do you see this playing out from your side in R&D research where you sit? I mean, this is really a big part of what you're having to deal with.
Yeah, our manufacturing division is really, they don't want to see me anymore. Every time I show up, I got bad news.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's difficult. And I think, again, all of these different initiatives have the intent, at least, to try and improve life for citizens in Europe or citizens in the United States, do the right thing. But you need to understand the knock-on effects. You do need to understand how this is collectively impactful, and where it really, where do you need to focus the effort for the legislators to really make the difference? Because what you don't want to do is just limit what happens in your environment. So I know there are interested parties in Europe who are looking at, can we look at a more holistic picture of environmental burdens? Can we look at how IP is being done? But from the broad trends, these are global supply chains. They have to sustain. They have to be reasonable. They have to be cost efficient. And we need to have a high caliber staff to be working in these settings. Funnily enough, those sort of policies don't seem to pop up very often. So I think what we're really looking for is who's got the ambition to really grow a biopharma sector in future, as opposed to trying to put as many burdens on it as it can at one time.
That's
Go
a
ahead,
good
Harry.
point, because when you mentioned that, immediately in my mind I thought Asia. It could be that you impose all these barriers and do all these things, and Asia just blossoms and continues to invest in biopharma and this, and eventually, we lose out. We lose out because we're isolated, we're expensive. It's just an example, unfortunately, of government sticking its hand, what I call messing with markets, and I think that the consequences of that are quite enormous.
I think another point I'd just like to raise is that if we look at bringing manufacturing back, it's so popular with the American public. I mean, I think 60-70% people would say, yeah, we should be manufacturing things here. So it's attractive when he says it. Whether it's practical, whether it will happen is another question altogether. But it's the same thing with steel. Fascinating article I read this morning about steel in Birmingham, England, and how Britain is losing its edge as far as that's concerned. And people are trying to figure out ways of bringing this back, but it's up against so many tough obstacles, from energy cost to mining for the materials, and to environmental things, and it's all directly applicable to the biopharmaceutical industry.
In the study we did on the GPL, we looked at a cohort of 350 drugs to try and find all the drugs that were innovated and produced in Europe. And from that 350, we found a big whopping 17. Do we run the risk now of doing what Europe did and pushing and incentivizing all of the R&D to move to the U.S.? Or now that we're putting barriers to entry, are we going to incentivize everything to move to China? JP Morgan, they announced at the JP Morgan conference this year that 75% of all the new INDs, the new listings for clinical development and oncology, are Chinese assets. Jenny, you're shaking your head. What do you think? Or, I mean, you and I have been fighting this fight in Europe for almost 2 decades now.
And I had a little fun today getting ready for this, because I don't get asked to be grumpy very often.
It just comes naturally.
Yeah,
to
it does
you,
come naturally.
Yeah.
But I did a little homework, and I found actually on the U.S. trade site the reasons that they put down to why the U.S. biopharma industry is globally leading is because it provides a robust R&D investment.
Okay.
And we've just been talking about the IRA.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the impacts to price negotiation.
Check. Yeah.
Supportive regulatory environment.
Check.
And we've just had a massive hit to the FDA, and we need to see that stabilize. There's a lot. It's a great BioCentury survey that shows how concerned people are that, this won't work. Intellectual property protection has strong intellectual property laws. Again, we need
Margin rights.
Yep. Large market size. Again, we talked about that. long may it last, but that's the risk.
Well, Europe's a larger market than the U.S.
And it is. It technically is.
Yes.
And China's fast growing. An advanced scientific research base, and I don't need to tell you guys what's been happening at NIH. I'm sure Harry's colleagues at the university are feeling this every day. This is a deep concern and the impact that it could have. And then finally, venture capital, the availability thereof. And again, it worries me that, the latest commentary from venture capitalists is that they are deeply concerned by the tariff situation. They're deeply concerned about what's going on with NIH and HHS and FDA. And so, the 6 things that the U.S. trade has rightly pointed out are their key success factors.
They're bell cows.
Yeah. Now we're
skinning the bell cow.
Yeah. That's got to be a moment of pause, don't you think?
We always used to go in and say, nose under the camel's tent, blah, blah, blah. I mean, is the camel now running around in the tent and going to other tents? And
the camel has torn the tent apart.
They've let the goats in. Are you kidding?
Yeah. They're having little camels already. It's really a problem. And Duane and I we talk about this, a lot. Duane's unique perch, sitting in Brussels, living in Brussels, allows him to see all the crazy ideas that emanate out of the European Union, and we've realized over time that those are easily exportable here to the U.S., and that's exactly what we're seeing. And the intellectual property protections is a really great example, because we were told compulsory licensing, that is not something that we're going to ever have to worry about in the United States. It just isn't, because we're the United States of America. And we're not far from that. Every time we turn around, there's another assaulted intellectual property. We're working on a really interesting project right now. We won't disclose exactly what, but an academic has made an assertion that the pharmaceutical industry in the academic medical centers are sort of working together to forget to state government interest on intellectual property, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's just these are the kinds of this is a reputational hit. This is something that the industry is bound and determined to fight.
Final question for everyone today. Obviously, what we're dealing with here is a lot of reputational damage that the industry has caused, and unfortunately, a lot of its, in many ways, own goals due to the handling of COVID, I think a lot of this was some ham-fisted policies that have caused some real negative impacts on the industry reputation. How can they be fixed? Harry, what do you think needs to happen here? I'll start with you, Harry, because you're always Mr. Optimist. What do we need to do here?
Yeah, I don't know, other than holding some entities accountable, if we can show that some things were not properly done. As far as the COVID thing goes, I think you're right. I'll be optimistic. We've had a change of administration, at least in the federal government. While there are still fringe actors that are out there saying things like Joe mentioned, I guess, the study, and there's always going to be people attacking. I think this is a form of jealousy and ideology that drives people in this direction, and okay, that's a difference of opinion, and hopefully we'll continue to win out on that. I think that, in a sense, the less that government can be involved in these markets, the best, and that's the best thing I can say. So I have some optimism from the standpoint of Trump administration that maybe their effort to reduce the size of government and the overreach of government, that maybe that will help some of these things, but there are instincts within the administration that also seem to run counter to what we all, I think, would prefer as a kind of policy. So I'm sort of neutral on what's going to happen in the future. Again, we always have attacks. That's why we've been fighting the same battles on tariffs for 300 years in saying to people, look, tariffs are not this great thing that you think they are. And I was thinking just in the past conversation there about the handloom weavers in England, right, that fought innovation in the textile industry. Right. And it just goes on. And maybe the best thing is we ought to be a little bit better historical students and look a little more back in history and recount these kinds of episodes and understand that they usually are negative. That's the best I can say at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Joe, you obviously managed a lot of reputational issues at Pfizer in your previous role. What do you think needs to happen now?
Well, I have to second what Harry said. You have to have a full accounting for what happened. There has to be an investigation into why the things happened the way they did. I'm not going to go into specifics, right now, but the trust in science is something that has really taken a hit over the last 5 years. That's devastating. As a scientist, it hurts. It really does. I talk to people, whether they be lay people or neighbors or family, and people ask me all the time, is there really a problem? Is this Wuhan thing real? And, but people don't know. They really, truly, honestly don't know. And we have to remember that. So many leaders dismissed science and dismissed real investigations and real critiques. You couldn't critique various higher-ups because if you did, you were a denier and you were a conspiracy theorist or whatever. And that isn't how science works. And science is never settled. Science continues to evolve. Things that we think we know today, as we dig deeper, we find out that we didn't know as much as we did. But I'm very, very concerned about the reputation of science and scientists, and it's what's going to lead us into better health and better health care, better sources of energy, cleaner sources of energy, everything across the board. We have to be able to trust science and scientists. A lot of people are going to be working on that in the years ahead to try to repair some of that, the damage that's been done.
Jenny, from your perspective, what do you think needs to happen?
So I'll be the grumpy outcast and say I don't agree. It was I could see good things, and especially, I must admit, I was one of those people who thought there is no way in hell they're going to develop a vaccine that quickly, but they did.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that I would really emphasize here is what we've lost, and I totally take the point that Joe made earlier that we haven't made a very good explanation over the years to help people understand what we do. They may not care how much I spend on it, but they should at least understand how it works. And the fact that it's very nuanced and it's not going to be cut and dry. It's not going to be black or white. And that's the problem, is that people are now expecting an answer in a 30-second TikTok. I don't know how to do that and explain the complexity of science. I need people that are willing to engage in the complexity of the scientific discussion we need to have. And my only suggestion that I've been spitballing with my friend Jim at work is we want a Netflix series, but not one that's just going to, spend forever talking about, Purdue Pharma. I need one that's talking about how challenging it is to develop something that may or may not work. And so it's probably going to need to have a comedy writer in there somewhere just to make it fun to watch. But it's important for people to understand how complex this is. And it's not something that is going to naturally come through in a simple, easy narrative. And that's what we've been struggling with. But that's not a reason to give up. That's a reason to double down.
Unfortunately, we're in a bumper sticker society, and pharmaceutical
That's a
research.
long bumper sticker.
Oh my God! And it's all fine print too. It's all very, very small and legalese. Well, as we mentioned, our peer-reviewed study on the Inflation Reduction Act, called the Inflation Reduction Act's Impact Upon Early-Stage Venture Capital Investments, is available for free download on our website. Jenny, thank you for being grumpy
Thanks
with
for
us.
bringing me on. This is fun.
It's a pleasure. Dr. Bowen, Harry Bowen, always a pleasure to see you, you grumpy old dude. How you doing?
Nice to see everybody. Yeah, I'm
Thank you,
doing
Harry.
fine. Doing fine.
Thank you. And Joe, always a pleasure, sir. Hope you're well.
All good, thank you. And it was a great conversation. And Ginny,
Yeah.
you're a welcome addition to the grumpy.
Yeah.
Well, bring
Fun.
me back anytime.
The grumpy
I thought
people.
we were going to call it Three Grumpies and a Lady. I thought that's
Yeah,
what
that's a
it
good
was.
one.
Well,
Yeah.
three
Grumpy old lady.
Well, we got 4 grumpies, I think, just from any gender perspective. It doesn't matter.
Jenny
With
doesn't
that-
seem very grumpy to me.
I'm going to work on that.
Well, I'm going to go pour a couple cocktails in there and we'll sort that out. With that,
Okay. Okay.
thank you very much. This concludes the Grumpy Podcast. Have a good day, everyone. The producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Duane Schulthess. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.